Right, I'm delighted now to hand over to the Opergy team, to Chris, Connor, and Sarah. I'm not sure who's going first, but yeah, please, I'll hand over now and let you continue.
Thank you, Steve. And hello, everyone. Really delighted to be here talking to you about this project that we've been working on for, well, since last summer, actually, on behalf of the Greater South East Net Zero Hub. So I'm Chris Blincoe, Associate Director at Opergy and Project Director for this project that we've been undertaking that we've called Local Industrial Clusters. It's a mapping study and also the development of a decarbonisation tool to support industrial clusters across the Greater South East region. And you can see them dotted on the map on the slide at the moment. So I will, as Steve mentioned, be handing over to my colleague Sarah Niddrie-Webb to take you through part of the presentation, and then we'll have a little break, and then Connor Enright is going to pick up after that. So if we move to the next slide. Very quick introduction to us at the Opergy Group. So we're a private limited group of companies established in 2019. So great timing there, just before COVID, but 20 plus staff located in our headquarters in East Anglia, but also we've got offices in Scotland and in Wales, and someone posted over in Asia just to keep an eye on things over there too. We like to think of ourselves as experts in navigating the complexities of the energy transition that we're confronting at the moment, and really enabling partners and clients that we work with to identify and capture the benefits from their journeys towards a more sustainable, low carbon future. So our work really goes from clean energy generation, so it might be offshore wind, nuclear, etc., through to business, industrial and community decarbonisation pathways. And we partner with businesses, developers, government, local government, communities and others to create and implement what we like to think of as innovative plans, technologies and sustainable growth strategies for a clean growth and net zero future. So that's the advert over. If we go on to the next slide. So what we're going to be covering today, I'm going to take that first point there. So just a brief introduction to the project that we've been working on with the Greater South East Net Zero Hub and its key objectives. I'll then pass over to Sarah, who will talk about some of the mapping work we've done, mapping all of the industrial cluster sites across the Greater South East region. I should say that's the Greater South East region, excluding Greater London. Thirdly, we'll talk about the software tools that we've developed for local place-based industrial decarbonisation planning, some of the testing work we did on those tools with real-life industrial sites, and also how we've applied them across counties and the region as a whole as well, just to crunch some data at that level too. And then we'll just finish up with some key findings, lessons learned and next steps. So if we go to the next slide, Harley's obviously already covered some of this in the last presentation. So I think we know now the challenge that is faced around industrial emissions across the UK, and also, as alluded to in the last presentation, there has, for understandable reasons, been a good deal of focus on the large industrial clusters, but our project is looking to provide some support to some of those smaller, more dispersed industrial sites that have that could do with a bit of help and support, we think, as well. So again, as mentioned previously, those government strategies and funding, for instance, supporting LIDPs have revealed that there's many areas with significant industrial activity, but perhaps lack some of that coordinated support needed to decarbonise collectively. So the Greater South East Net Zero Hub's strategic response to this was in part to commission the work that we've been undertaking over the last 9 months or so. And what we've done is, I guess there's three main things here. One, bring together local insights from what have been a range of relatively ad hoc, I suppose, projects that have happened at industrial cluster sites across the Greater South East region, looking at decarbonisation potential, build on some of those national policy shifts towards encouraging place-based collaborative decarbonisation across closely located small to medium-sized industrial sites, and then finally for us to develop a replicable model for mini clusters, as they were termed in our initial scope. So those outside of the major UK industrial heartlands, to really highlight viable site-specific decarbonisation investment opportunities. So if we flick to the next slide, so just to dive into those project objectives a little more. So we kicked off with an overall objective to develop tools to enable scalable support services that can support decarbonisation of local energy communities in defined industrial areas to help enable a collaborative transition to net zero. And like I say, our work is sort of split into two halves, I suppose, as it was initially designed. So Sarah is going to talk over the sort of background research and mapping that we did to understand who are the industrial clusters across the Greater South East region. As part of that, we had to kind of come up with our own definition to some extent of what was a mini cluster at this scale. And as Sarah's noted, there's a report published on the Greater South East Net Zero Hub website that talks about all of that work. And then after we've had a little break, Connor is going to talk about the model and the tools that we developed to support collaborative decarbonisation across these industrial sites. So just a couple more slides for me to lead in. So if we flip to the next one. So again, to break that down a little bit more, in delivering our project objectives, we've really focused in on 4 key parts to this work, which encapsulate what we've done and what we hope will follow as the hub rolls it out across the Greater South East region. So everything from understanding where and who the industrial clusters are, right through to hopefully forming a pipeline of appropriate decarbonisation projects across the region's industrial clusters. So these 4 key parts of this approach to decarbonisation of these smaller dispersed industrial clusters are starting off around identification, so that initial piece of site mapping, desk-based research, and using local knowledge to identify and map industrial cluster sites, and then build a database that includes some high-level data and characteristics about each of those sites, from size to archetypes, sort of high-level CO2 emissions, etc. Phase 2 is around investigation and assessment. So we've built a local authority or a software tool that can be used by local authorities to identify and select sites. So at a local authority level, you could really just do this sort of quick desk-based assessment of which industrial clusters are most ready for decarbonisation and in a position to get value from the industrial decarbonisation tool that we've developed. And so that will look at things like data availability on different industrial cluster sites, governance arrangements. Is there any sort of governance across these sites that's actually pulling together landowners and tenants in any way? And is there any sort of resource perhaps available to coordinate data collection across those sites? And obviously this in turn will then highlight support that cluster sites might need in order to have some of those things in place. And that might be where local authorities could potentially step in and provide some of that support. Thirdly, around assessment, so collecting site-specific data on energy consumption, building type, vehicle use, etc., and using that to populate our decarbonisation tool to indicate and prioritise most appropriate and investable routes for decarbonisation across a whole site, but also broken down by tenants and by building. Much more information on this to follow. And finally, around implementation, so communicating the outputs to tenants and delivery partners to form a project pipeline of hopefully investable opportunities and select appropriate delivery vehicles for them. So I think it's also worth saying that the outputs from our tool won't answer every question around decarbonisation and investment, etc. But hopefully it will help users to really ask the right questions, identify cost-effective decarbonisation opportunities that perhaps otherwise they might not have been aware of, particularly when collaborating across a whole site. So moving on, final slide from me before I hand over to Sarah and then Connor. But I just wanted to highlight what we see as the four main user groups that we believe our work and the tools we've developed can be most useful to, and why. We're conscious that many or all of these groups might be represented in this virtual room today, and hopefully this table just helps you as we go through to consider how our work and its outputs might be of benefit both to you in your role, but also to other partners or collaborators you might work with. So if you're, for instance, a local authority economic development officer, the tools can support strategic decision making, helping to identify where industrial cluster sites are within your patch, their individual nature, their comparative readiness for decarbonisation, and also, again, for those sites that are less ready to decarbonise, how a local authority might best be able to support them to be more ready to decarbonise. Then for potentially site managers or coordinators working across a particular industrial cluster, whilst fully appreciating those people and those roles don't necessarily always exist at the industrial clusters we've identified, there would be a key role in helping to coordinate collection of site-wide data from tenants that's needed to get best value from the tool we've developed, and also their role in then identifying and communicating to tenants the opportunities and benefits of decarbonisation, particularly at a site-wide level. Then for individual businesses or tenants on an industrial cluster, they can themselves benefit from the tool's outputs. The more data they put in, the more they'll benefit from the outputs, but they can then better understand their own energy and emissions profile, compare themselves with others, and identify practical steps that they can take and investments they can make to decarbonise and hopefully save a bit of money along the way. And then finally, at a sort of local or regional energy and decarbonisation planning level, I guess the value lies in bringing the bigger picture together around industrial energy use and decarbonisation opportunities that can in turn then help to inform local and regional energy plans and infrastructure coordination. So hopefully that's helped to set the scene a little in terms of what we've done, why we've done it, and who it's for. But at that point, I will pass over to Sarah, who can pick up the story from here.
Thanks, Chris. Hopefully you can all hear me. And next slide, please. Oh, I think we're seeing something we shouldn't. Skip past that. Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So as we've heard a little bit already that Chris has introduced, and some of the kind of introduction pieces that Steve also gave us, we started this piece of work with, at this first step, identifying the sites across the Greater South East that are suitable for and should be and could be approaching industrial decarbonisation on this local basis. We started the work engaging with Steve and his team at the hub. We also spoke to county councils and district councils to understand what they understood about their areas and the spread and disbursement of industrial activity across those. Yes, of course, this region is characterised mostly by these kind of more dispersed industrial sites. And we really understood, and just to reinforce what we've already heard, that actually it's very difficult for the hub and for some local authority partners to really understand this information, understand what is there, especially for those that are looking over a large area. So we did this mapping work. You can see some images here and a summary table showing the outputs of that, and it's all detailed in the report that we've linked here. We did investigation and research on what those sites were and where they're located. We considered LIDP projects already receiving funding, free ports, economic areas to identify those, and we also referenced a lot of information from different partners and from our own knowledge, and a lot of desk-based research, to be honest, to identify all in all over 1,000 different sites across the wide geography that we've managed to pick out. We looked at those quite critically to consider where they were located close to each other. For instance, 2 business parks neighbouring each other, and grouped those sites where that was appropriate, where we could see that it might be helpful for those 2 sites to consider their options around decarbonisation together, as well as individual mini clusters or small groups of businesses. And that gave us, when we consolidated and brought that together, that gave us a picture of just over 550 different sites across the region. As you can see in the table, hopefully your screen's big enough to see that, they're really varied in terms of size, from really small to quite large acreage, and also really varied in terms of the estimated emissions from those sites identified. We worked that out by identifying the site that we were talking about, drawing a picture around it, and you'll see some of those images from our next slides, and using the National Atmospheric Inventory data to analyse the industrial and commercial emissions associated with those shapes that we'd drawn. So it's a little bit of an estimation, certainly not based on specific data from those sites, but it gives this research an understanding of where the biggest concentrations of industrial emissions are likely to be. Of the 550 sites, 121 of those were shown to have estimated emissions of over 1,000 tonnes. So we considered that for our work to identify where it would be great to start. And those sites, they accounted for over 85% of all of the emissions across all of the sites that we identified. So really reinforcing that picking the sites with the largest emissions is a great place to start. On to the next slide, please. We considered of the sites that we'd picked out and found through the research, what type of site were they? And we considered different archetypes, from light industrial and warehousing and distribution and a bit of manufacturing maybe, to sites that contained offices or leisure and retail kinds of uses, or even domestic uses were identified in a really small proportion of the sites that we found, considering that we were looking for industrial sites and not domestic sites. So understanding this information, and that most of those are characterised by light industrial users and warehousing and distribution users, really gave us some insight into, for the future, for the next stages of the tool, and our solutions, who we are catering to, the type of business and the type of user that will ultimately be able to use and benefit from these tools. Next slide, please. So this starts to show us in a little bit more granular detail what we see on a smaller scale. This shows we picked Norfolk. It's where our main office is located, and we tested the tool as we were developing it with a number of different sites. You'll see later, Connor will take you through some of the outputs of that. So we picked Norfolk as a area to show you for the purposes of this identification. There was 50 sites we found in Norfolk, quite dispersed, and really characterised by some being located in more built up areas, but a lot of more rural sites were identified here as well. 12 of those had emissions estimated of over 1,000 tonnes, and that was 80% of the emissions there. And really, light industrial was the kind of use of those sites that we found. Next slide, please. And this slide shows you some of the really granular detail on the mapping that we did. You can see in the map image there that there is some lightly shaded shapes there where we drew the outline of the industrial area that we were considering in the analysis. And each of those has a little reference number that if you can see it closely on your screen, you'll see. In addition to the main report that I've provided a link for, we've also produced a county-based report for all of the counties covered by this research across the Greater South East. So, and these include the detailed maps that you see on here and also a data table. So it includes all the information on all of the sites that we found. Next slide, please. So into the first kind of steps of our tool solution that we built. So with this information, and really we think that the users of this particular element that Chris outlined first, the users who want to kind of take this first step, identifying the sites, they're likely to be local authority economic development officers, maybe officers or members of the sustainability teams in the local authority who maybe support the local authority themselves or businesses in their patch. Also, local or regional energy planners might find this information and this element of the tool really useful. So you can see in the top rung there, this is an Excel-based tool and it allows the user to input information about the sites that they've identified. They could take that from our mapping or their own knowledge. So you can list and put in up to 10 sites at a time, and then it asks you questions to indicate how much information that you understand the site has on a number of categories. So prior work they might have done to look at decarbonisation. Is there an existing governance structure? Is there perhaps a business site owner who might help and encourage this activity to happen? Do you believe that they have data available on their energy consumption, those kinds of things? And is there growth potential at the site? Are they planning future buildings or future infrastructure on those sites? It also asks the user to consider what their priorities are. Are they looking for to save businesses money on the site, or are they looking to consider the options around challenges of grid constraints, perhaps? Are they thinking about overall county emissions and driving those down as easily as possible? So with that information put in and some judgments made by the user based on their own knowledge and really an immediately limited requirement to go out and find more information, it will produce a result in terms of the best places to start. On to the next slide, please. So this begins to show some of the outputs. All of the sites put into this tool have received a score, and the higher the score, the more ready they are to consider decarbonisation. So it might help the user to say, right, well, I'll start with these ones who are scoring highest in terms of encouraging them and supporting them to continue onto decarbonisation. Where sites score poorly in particular elements captured by the tool, it also provides this helpful output, which indicates why it scored, why that site has scored badly. So it might be that it recommends that really we need to build more information on the site's availability of data, or perhaps if they haven't got an established kind of coordinator to help with this activity, then that will reflect in scoring poorly. So it really provides the user with some really helpful guidance here in terms of, okay, what do you do next in terms of helping these sites to prepare for the challenge that's ahead of them in terms of understanding their decarbonisation. I think that's on to the next slide.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So it's really important to note this tool has kind of 4 different user journeys that are available to those different user groups that were just polled against. And we tried to build a platform that's as flexible as possible to kind of prioritize client ease and to build momentum in these initial energy planning stages. But that also can be maintained and adapted for a range of kind of pre-feasibility contexts and really start towards the development of these projects in earnest. And so I'll start to walk through the kind of processes from investigation through to implementation. And I'll highlight as we walk through how this kind of zooms out, kind of zooms in from an economic development officer or a regional energy planner through to the individual tenants and then back out again in terms of how we really make change. So we left off with Sarah discussing how the site assessment tool or qualification tool can identify the data gaps that are needed to provide those kind of valuable bits of outputs around kind of quantified carbon impacts, financial impacts, impacts on growth, that kind of thing. And so once you've got this list of data gaps, it's time to start filling them. And the way that we equip you to help with that is by providing a couple of variations of a long form questionnaire that can be sent to individual tenants or to people who've got a kind of high level view of the site. It's really important to note that we've designed this so that the kind of the mandatory data is as minimal as possible. And that can actually be done from a desktop basis. So really, we need to know the floor area, the SIP code of the businesses, and the name of each building to really start to make some benchmarking and initial estimations around the electricity use. We've also got some mandatory data that's in there for high-level kind of quantification exercises, core data for the site-specific calculations, and then some additional contextual detail that's captured here. But effectively, this questionnaire includes features such as data validation, built-in unit conversion, and full segregation of tenant responses to allow the most detailed data to be gathered, to be segregated so that all users are comfortable, and then to be really easily output in the kind of context and format that the tool expects, so that the tool operator can very rapidly collate the inputs from various from various questionnaires. Each questionnaire can capture up to 10 buildings and 10 proposed developments, and that allows the economic development officer to gather lots of information quite quickly. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we can start to see how that data is used. So this gives kind of an idea of how that data is used in the quantification, moving from left to right. It starts with a very simple copying of a table into the input format within the tool, and that's all designed for the ease of the tool operator, the cluster manager, or the economic development officer to do with minimal effort. The system then uses a load of regional statistics and Duke's data to fill in the gaps, acknowledging that not all tenants will have kind of a full view of their fuel data, or that maybe they're at the initial steps of engagement and they haven't quite managed to allocate the time to go out and collect all of this information from the offset. So that fuel consumption is filled with Duke's data and then disaggregated by the end use within a region. So we're looking at the East of England here. So we've used Duke's data for the East of England to start to pull apart what the expected energy uses are across things like lighting, motors, space heating, high and low temperature processes. That disaggregated data is then fed into a module which uses the fuel data along with the building characteristics to qualify which projects we think are relevant for each business. And then we use a range of assumptions and reference data to quantify that and to produce things like overall investment costs, revenue figures, which can then be fed into a financial model to produce some of the graphical outputs and some of the financial indicators. We really encourage you to play with this tool, and we've got a full documentation of the calculation methods that are available. So it's not a black box, and you can get in there and really understand what's going on. Part of the reason that we document those calculation methods and that we have this multi-layered approach is that we kind of really believe in both transparency, but also in setting up a structure that has a kind of hierarchy of assumptions. We want this to work where data isn't available, because we know that at the kind of regional energy planning level, that you haven't got your fingertips on all of the data that one would like for such a technical exercise. And so it builds up from this reference data, regional statistics, through to user-defined assumptions, and all the assumptions within this spreadsheet can be modified and changed by the user without overwriting the default value. So you can do kind of quick and dirty modeling. And then where there's user site-specific data that's been input, that will replace some of those assumptions. And that's really to make this tool as adaptable and maintainable over time, because we really want it to prove to be as useful and to have the greatest longevity possible for the hub and for their clients. And just touching on some of those assumptions, we're looking at things like flexibility payment rates, emissions factors, which we'll touch on later, fuel costs, expected efficiency gains and generation yields for different technologies, economy of scale savings, self-consumption rates, cost of carbon, and then things like discount rates and grant funding availability for the financial modelling. So if we move on to the next slide, we can start to see how some of these graphical outputs can be used. And so here we're really looking at the Regional Energy Strategic Planner, or a kind of local authority EDO use case. And this shows some electricity emissions and electricity consumption for a specific site along the A11. I'd like to highlight here how this could be used in future proofing and forecasting. So the tool looks both at the current buildings that are there, as well as future development prospects and planned growth at a site. So you can see in the middle the current buildings, you can see on the left the addition of future growth, and just the difference that makes in terms of kind of moving the emissions baseline and the amount of work that needs to be done to bring that growth back down towards net zero. We blanked out some of the details within this real life example, but the bar on the right actually represents a new business park that's being built alongside those existing buildings. And some of the work that we did with the local authority was understanding the impact that would make on local constrained networks. And you can see just the scale of that new building and the electricity consumption that's associated with it on top of the planned growth at the site. And so this really highlights how, if you're a regional energy planner, you can start to use a tool like this just to input the acreage and the types of businesses expected within planned development, and start to get a very quick idea of what that means in terms of the magnitude of impacts on emissions, but also on constrained networks and the kind of shifting baseline moving towards net zero targets. If we move to the next slide, please, we can see how this starts to break down in terms of individual buildings and individual fuel sources. So you can see we've got the names for the site-wide figures, and that bar third from the left represents the new development that was kind of up and coming, but not necessarily fully in sight and in scope. And then you can see some of the smaller bars, which the names have been blanked out for, represent individual buildings and individual businesses within that site. So you can really zoom down to the individual level, as well as considering aggregated sites in a more generic way. The little yellow arrow there is just pointing to the filter here. And we've designed all of these graphical outputs using kind of smart and automated pivot tables, so that the user can very quickly perhaps take out some outliers, so the kind of site-wide views and the aggregated business parks, and look at individual businesses. But also, if you're an economic development officer or a regional energy planner, and you want to look at specific business parks or specific businesses and send them these outputs to start a conversation, it's very quick to go in and interrogate these carbon footprint estimates at an individual business level. And you can see here just how important electricity growth is expected to be across these different businesses and business parks. So what to do about it? If we move to the next slide, please, we can start to see a range of interventions recommended for a specific tenant. This has been called Unit 12 fairly generically, and that is the name of the unit in question. Now, this tenant operated a freeze drying business and so had cold storage as well. And so there's quite a positive potential for different electrical and insulation measures. And as you can see, we've got two outputs kind of interacting on this table. On the left axis, we've got the kind of annualized revenue impact. So that's the additional savings or cost implications in some cases of delivering these measures. And on the right, we've got the annual carbon saving. And so this gives a business an idea of how that might change their cost control, how the kind of cost savings and the carbon savings balance up against one another, and starts to let them do the kind of prioritization of interventions, identify low-hanging fruit, and maybe start to talk to their neighbours or to their economic development officers around what grants are available, whether they could form a programme to install some of these measures at scale or collaborate with their fellow businesses, or whether they should just go ahead and start work on developing some of these projects themselves. And so for a cluster manager or an individual tenant, this really helps to drive forward the interventions that are most relevant, and to identify the likely technologies that might have the most beneficial returns in terms of both carbon savings and financial investment. So it's important to note that this is just an annualized revenue impact. But if we move to the next slide, please, we can see some of the same interventions expressed in terms of net present value. And so you can see here, not everything is universally going to have a positive net present value with some of the assumptions that are in there currently. Solar thermal, for example, for a freeze drying plant is not ideal, as one might expect. There's limited kind of space heating requirements that can be delivered by the solar thermal. The battery storage is also a investment that doesn't have a positive net present value with the current set of assumptions that are there. That doesn't mean that it's not worth more investigation. If that's something that the tenant is interested in, you could start to drill down to those assumptions and understand how that might affect their self-consumption of solar power, or whether actually they should explore different options such as thermal inertia within their cold storage areas. The type of net present value that we've expressed here is called net present value quotient, and I won't get too technical, but it effectively expresses per pound of investment, what's your time adjusted return? So, taking in LEDs, for example, per pound over the lifetime of the project, they might expect to receive £30 of return. And we've assumed a 35-year lifespan for most of these measures, but that again can be adjusted on an individual technology basis. That's not the only financial indicator that we present. We also present the simple payback, the internal rate of return, and the lifetime carbon savings within one view, so that tenants can really understand how these different interventions stack up and what their kind of priority list of interventions might be as they move through those different options. And as I say, there's a full documentation of all the calculation methods, and all of these assumptions can be updated and maintained over time to give real site-specific detail. So if we move to the next slide, please, we can start to see now that we're zooming back out to the site-wide level. And if you're an economic development officer or a cluster manager, you want to talk to individual businesses, you want them to understand the art of the possible and how they can make change internally. But also we know that a lot of these industrial clusters kind of require programmatic support. They might have additional opportunities to work with their neighbours. And so when you start to tie together all of these different interventions, you both see new interventions that might not be applicable to one business. So for example, the off-site vehicle fleet, fuel switching, so electrification or switching to HVO, as well as how combining these things at scale have an impact. And so you can start to model things like economies of scale savings here, as well as understanding, okay, which technologies have the greatest potential both in terms of carbon saving and in terms of overall financial impact. So, for example, the HVO fuel switch, it doesn't have a positive financial impact, but it has got the highest annual carbon savings of all the measures here. And so that's something you might want to consider. Another thing to highlight here, and this goes back to the adaptability of the tool, is that this used 2024 emissions figures. And that made electrification look even less favourable than it might in other contexts because of the amount of gas that we were burning in 2024, or the intensity of the grid factors in 2024 around the different kind of macroeconomic and global impacts that the UK experienced. You can come in later years and update those emissions figures or model them using perhaps more representative figures from the past and start to play around with how these different interventions compare in different kind of scenarios and different cases. But this really is about the prioritization and implementation stages of developing projects for or with tenants and allowing project pipelines to be rapidly iterated and deployed at an individual site. And so, this really helps to understand how this could be tailored for different end users. So both the kind of tool operator and the end client as an individual business. You could start to build out the site-wide views, but also technology-specific views for contractors or for delivery models, or where there are particular technologies that fall under grant funding options, and output those different views to those contractors or to those tenants to rapidly generate those project pipelines. So if we look at the next slide, please, we can start to see what that means in terms of implementation moving forwards. So we've started to get these prioritized list of interventions. And what we now need to do is to communicate with individual businesses, with some of those collaborative partnerships, what to do and why this is important. And so you can see here two views. The first at the top here is a list of what we call tangible figures. And you'll often see this in kind of green marketing, and it's designed to bring home the tons of carbon, the kilowatt hours of energy savings into something that means something to people, not just the kind of facilities manager and the CFO, but to individual employees or to directors within businesses. So we express here all of the measures in existing buildings in terms of the trees planted, the hours of passenger flight that have been abated, the miles driven, and the number of plastic bottles recycled. It's not a precise science, but it is helpful to start to understand what this really means in terms of environmental impact, and to start to motivate buy-in to develop these projects further. And when it comes to developing these projects further, we want to highlight this is still at the kind of taking you from vision development up to the feasibility stage. And so when you get to that feasibility stage, we present to you the list of qualifying questions and assumptions that we've made for your business for that particular technology measure. And so here we've got a couple of solar technologies, but it spans the full range of 21 technologies, and the questions that we've asked ourselves and that you can go away as a business and interrogate to see, okay, is there suitable space for ground mount PV? Do we have enough electricity import, or are there constraints around electricity export to justify this additional generation? Have we got the necessary permissions from our landlords to install things on the roof, for example? And so that really moves it away from the art of the possible towards an implementation stage, and it can allow economic development officers, cluster managers to start to make these project pipelines real. But if we move to the next slide again, we can just start to continue to zoom back out to that regional energy planners view, and we know how important that is to the people in this webinar today, and start to highlight some of the industrial potential that this tool has identified, making some broad assumptions about Norfolk as a whole, and on the next slide, the Greater South East region, and to give an example of how this can provide kind of county and region-wide pictures around the industrial consumption and the opportunities for decarbonisation. So these are some high-level estimations that extrapolated from the real site that we saw earlier in the presentation, and it considers the land use of the current buildings and the future developments applied to the acreage of industrial clusters that was identified by Opergy, and then applies some electrical, takes the electrical consumption that Opergy estimated and applies that Duke's data to work out some of the kind of generation potentials, and to work out some of the different energy efficiency measures and what kind of abatements they could provide. So some of the assumptions here are, we're looking at 10% of the total area being available for ground mount solar, 5% for carport PV, and the wind potential looks lower than it is. There is small wind potential there. We've effectively assumed that there's 1 or 2 wind turbines dotted around these individual sites. So we're not talking about wind farms, and that's why some of those figures look a little bit low. But really, this is about proving the impact that we could have at a regional basis. And on the next slide, please, we can see what that looks like for the Greater South East region around abating some of the consumption from these industrial sites. It's important to highlight here that this is a proportion figure expressed against those industrial consumption, and not the kind of total non-domestic for the Greater South East overall. So I'll pass back to Chris now to talk a little bit more about some of the lessons we've learned. But yeah, just wanted to highlight that potential, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Connor. If we just move to the next slide, I don't know if everyone else is seeing the number of slides that are in this pack as is showing on my screen, which says 68, and we're only on number 40. Don't worry, there's only 2 slides left. But if we can just flick on to the next one. There we go. So I think it's fair to say that the sort of key findings, well, this is more about lessons learned from this project, were many. I'm just going to focus in on 4 here for the purposes of wrapping things up. On leadership to begin with, I think strong leadership we've seen is absolutely critical to enabling any of these sort of site-wide decarbonisation opportunities that we've identified on the smaller industrial clusters. Getting some sort of governance in place to bring together landowners, tenants, communicate the opportunities for cost and carbon savings, and also then coordinate and drive delivery is something that's going to be absolutely key. Around data, it's always a sticky point when it comes to projects like this. Data will need to be collected from landowners, tenants across a site, again, to get a strong picture of site-wide energy use and then inform those decarbonisation recommendations that can come out of the tool. We've tried to make it as simple as possible to collect this data and make the tool as accessible as possible. I think we're going to hear in the next presentation around from Shoreham probably about some of the maybe the challenges they've faced in collecting data. But it is, again, actually a process that needs leadership, needs coordination across a site, whether that's a local authority getting involved or a particular enthusiastic business leader. We were very fortunate with one of the sites we tested at that there was a real strong advocate who sort of helped us with collecting data and actually got loads of data from different businesses back within a week for us, having completed our forms that we could then populate the tool with. But that won't always be the case, and it might even be that some sort of incentivization is needed there. But actually that incentivization for tenants to provide data could be in the form of, well, if you give us this data, then this is what you get back. It will give you an idea of the most cost-effective decarbonisation options for your site. It will give you an idea of your carbon footprint as a business. On the people side, I think relationships are key within an industrial cluster site, just because it might be that there is an absolute no-brainer, what looks like a no-brainer opportunity to decarbonise and save or even make money off the back of it that's identified perhaps through use of a tool like this. But if not everyone's on board with that, there might be various reasons why it doesn't happen. I think we can probably all think of relationships where people don't quite get on or don't quite see eye to eye or whatever, and that is another part of actually making particularly these cross-site interventions really happen. So again, it comes back to leadership. Maybe there's a bit of mediation that can come in there as well, just to try and make the point and get some of these recommendations through. And then finally, I suppose around timing, so doing the kind of pre-feasibility assessments that this tool that we've built enables can give really early insights into industrial cluster investment opportunities, whether that's site-wide or whether it's for an individual tenant, that can make cost and carbon sense and may not have been considered if there hadn't been a tool like this that can just highlight, well, there are different ways of doing things. I mean, we've certainly, and I'm sure others on this call have seen examples where industrial sites have maybe worked with local authorities and perhaps made investments that seem absolutely sensible on paper, perhaps address grid constraints, for instance, that are getting in the way of development, but perhaps made those investments just without being aware of all of the different options that might have been available to them. And what we hope is that our tool will relatively easily and quickly highlight those different options so that at least they're on the table and part of conversations and considerations when thinking about making future investments. And then the final slide, if we move on, just thinking about next steps and future opportunities. Obviously, for the rollout of this work that we've done, the tools and reports are very much belong to the hub, and they will be sort of rolled out through their normal channels and freely available and used to engage with clusters, tenants, and others. In terms of longevity, we're not saying these tools are perfect, and as Connor was alluding to earlier, things change over time, data changes over time. So we have built the tools with adaptability in mind and with options to update and tweak the data that goes into them, and whether that's carbon factors, energy unit costs, etc., just in order to help maintain relevance going forward. And then finally, in terms of our role as Opergy, we're very much here to help, keen to explore collaborative opportunities going forward to both implement and then potentially further develop this work. So whether that's around supporting local and regional energy planning, we've already had a few inquiries from people working on local area energy plans, interested in the data and the tools, supporting local authorities and cluster sites with rollout and implementation of this stuff. We're very much keen to hear from people who would like our support with that. Whether there are opportunities for full feasibility work to develop opportunities that are highlighted by the tools. Also very much interested in replicating this work across other UK regions. We've done it now for the Greater South East region. There's the mapping that we've done could certainly be replicated across other regions, and the tools again tweaked for use in other regions. And finally, the world of web-based interfaces and everything is developing always at breakneck speed. We're aware that we've built this in Excel. We think it's user-friendly, but there are further developments that might be useful in the future to make it even more so, and happy to discuss that with anyone who's interested. And I guess very finally, just to finish off, huge thanks to my team who have worked very diligently on this. So Connor and Sarah are on the call, but Sam Reed, Johnny Ruffle, Ella Craggs, our brilliant graduate intern who actually received an award for the work that she did on this project. Very grateful to them for their work over the last 9 or 10 months. Also to the Hub team, of course, for guiding and supporting us along the way, and the many other contributors, local authorities, cluster sites who have told us about the work that they've done, etc., and those who have tested the tools and provided feedback. So thank you to all of those. And if anyone wants to get in touch, here are mine and Sarah's contact details. Please do drop us a note, and at that point I will hand back to Steve.